Welcome to this video about behaviourist learning theory from the MSc in Medical Education at the Swansea University Medical School. What I hope you're able to do by the end of this video is to describe the core principles of behaviourist learning theory, link some common teaching techniques to the behaviourist approach, describe the evidence base or not for behaviourist learning theory, and identify some criticisms of behaviourist learning theory. As always in this video, we're going to be taking a pragmatic approach to our understanding of this learning theory. We want to understand the basics of behaviorism, we want to understand the evidence base for it, but most importantly, we want to understand what is useful for us to take away from behaviorism to apply to our own teaching practice, use our judgment about where and when to apply it and the context in which we might apply it, to arrive at a pragmatic, evidence-based approach to education. I'm going to spend a couple of slides describing some of the basic principles of behaviorism. Perhaps the most important is the statement that behaviour is all you can observe and measure. A definition of a behaviour can be broad. It can include things like attending a lecture, attending a class, taking an assessment, passing an assessment. All of these are things that we can observe and measure. Successful education then can be measured as a behavioural change, an increase in assessment scores, an increase in attendance, a measure of engagement, and so on. As with many learning theories, behaviorism is in part defined by what it is not. Behaviourist psychology in general sets itself against the idea that we can observe and measure internal processes. It's very difficult for us to say what someone knows or say what someone understands or what they're thinking. What we can observe and measure is their behaviour, and therefore we should focus on that. A couple of other statements about what behaviorism is. Another important statement that's commonly associated with behaviorism is the idea that the consequences of an act affect the probability of its occurring again. This is the principle that underlies the idea of reinforcement. If you want to strengthen a desired behaviour, then you would reinforce that desired behaviour. Examples of this in education might be giving positive feedback or giving a high mark when a student demonstrates the things that you want them to be able to do. When a student demonstrates things that you don't want them to be able to do or is not achieving the desired behaviour, then you simply don't reinforce that behaviour. Very importantly, behaviourist learning theory is very much against the idea of punishment. It came about in part because punishment was very commonly used in teaching in the early parts of the 20th century. We apply this then by using the fundamental principle identified in this slide. We deliver a stimulus and observe the response. This relationship is at the heart of behaviourist psychology and a behaviourist approach to teaching. It's easy for us to explain this if we explain in detail some commonly observed behaviourist teaching techniques. Learning outcomes are the most obvious. Miller's pyramid is another one. You might remember learning outcomes from a previous video. Learning outcome is a statement of what learners should be able to do. And the key phrase, the key word in that statement is do. I gave you some examples of good and bad learning outcomes to do with learning about local anaesthetics. For example, a good learning outcome, which might be applied to a student early on in a health professions education course, is for them to be able to identify effective doses of local anaesthetics. Later on, we might want them to be able to administer effective doses of local anaesthetics. These are both good learning outcomes because the key verbs in there, to identify and to administer, are things that we can observe and measure. This is in contrast to so-called bad learning outcomes. A bad learning outcome, a statement of what we want learners to be able to do, might be to understand local anaesthetics or to know about local anaesthetics. These are bad because it's very difficult for us to observe and measure people's understanding, people's knowing. This again explains in part where behaviorism comes from. The whole idea of learning outcomes was a reaction to the idea that it's very difficult for us to measure and observe these things. Therefore, we need to write learning outcomes that can be measurable and observable. Another teaching technique that's very commonly associated with the behaviourist approach is so-called Miller's pyramid. This is very commonly used in the teaching of clinical skills. The idea is that we structure a curriculum or teaching sessions so that students start off being able to show that they know how a particular clinical skill works or know what it is that they're supposed to be able to do. We then move on to teaching them so that they can tell us that they know how. We move then further up the pyramid so that they can show us how to apply a particular skill. And then finally, the ultimate aim of a teaching session that's structured around Miller's pyramid is that a student can do the particular skill that we want them to be able to achieve. Is there any evidence to support the use of behaviourist teaching techniques? In large part, the answer is yes, but there are some caveats to that. If we think about what behaviorism is, the whole idea of it is that it is objective and measurable. Behaviourist psychology in general is evidence-based, it's reliable, it's reproduced, and it's been published over the course of the last 70 or so years. However, it is also from an educational perspective, the application of scientific experiments involving pigeons and rats, and sometimes people, to the practice of learning and teaching. Behaviorism is also very much misunderstood and misrepresented. This means then when we're trying to consider whether or not behaviorism is useful, the answer is largely yes, but there is an elephant in the room. That elephant is that behaviorism is, as a learning theory, very unpopular. Let me explain a bit about why. You will often see behaviorism described as being responsible for a lot of teaching practices that most of us would agree are not desirable. Things like rote learning, passive learning, didactic teaching. Behaviorism is often described as cold and authoritarian. There's a very famous experiment from the 1920s involving a baby called Little Albert. I won't give you the details except to say it wasn't a very pleasant experiment, but it's often used by people who are critical of behaviorism as evidence that behaviorism is not a very effective teaching technique or even a very moral teaching technique to use. Behaviorist teaching techniques are most commonly associated with the work of B.F. Skinner, but there are many other people besides him who were involved in the development of behaviorist teaching techniques. Punishment is often cited as a bad facet of behaviorist approaches to teaching, but as I explained earlier, Skinner in particular was very much against the idea of using punishment in teaching. In fact, his whole approach was designed to develop approaches that didn't use punishment. Lectures are also something that's very commonly associated with behaviorist approaches to teaching, and the idea of surface learning arising from rote learning is again something that behaviorism is often tarred with. Behaviorism, if you read the original text, is very much against all of these things, but unfortunately many other learning theories set themselves out to define themselves against behaviorism. They take behaviorism as a starting point and they tell us how they are different to behaviorism, but the version of behaviorism that they use is the version of behaviorism that I showed you on the previous slide, which is not actually accurate. In particular, the person who's responsible for some of these misrepresentations is unfortunately B.F. Skinner himself. Although he started out with his behaviorist approach to teaching by actively opposing rote learning and punishment, his work in experimental behavioral psychology often involved things like rats in what were called a Skinner box, pressing levers for reinforcers and rewards. He, as a joke, built a Skinner box for a young child. I believe this picture was actually his own child. And then in some of his early behaviorist teaching texts, you see pictures like this, black and white pictures of a young child standing in front of a machine, pressing buttons for reinforcers and rewards. Now, as I said, Skinner was very much progressive in his approach to learning and teaching. He was very much against the dominant paradigm of the day, which involved punishment, which involved rote learning, which is very didactic. He very much wanted students to be engaged and active. But unfortunately, these black and white pictures, based upon some experimental behavioral psychology, give an overall negative interpretation of what behaviorist teaching is all about. That negative interpretation is incorrect, but unfortunately, it's probably too late for us to change that. When it comes to then trying to understand whether behaviorism is useful, if we stick to the pure representation of behaviorism as described in some of Skinner's texts in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of Miller's pyramid, then yes, it probably is useful. Not least because behaviorism is all about what we can observe and what we can measure. Those are very useful principles to stick to when trying to describe teaching. Here are some references we've cited in this short video. If you have any questions about the content of the video or about the MSc in general, please do send me an email. All right, bye-bye.